All right. Good morning, everyone. I am Paul Bascobert, president of Reuters, and on behalf of Reuters, I welcome you to the launch of the 13th edition of the Digital News Report. Reuters is thrilled to partner with the Reuters Institute again on the launch event and to share insights from this year's report, which covers news consumption habits from over 47 countries, representing over half of the world's population. This edition highlights significant shifts in the digital landscape, including platform changes that have introduced new challenges for news publishers. Facebook and X, notably, have deprioritized news on their platforms, and this has caused declining traffic in publisher sites. Also, video has become more popular, and so too do the video networks of TikTok, YouTube. Notably, 2/3 of the respondents now watch short videos weekly, and over half engage with long-form video content. Another significant theme this year is the rise of generative AI. And while it's become a buzzword in newsrooms globally, it also raises concerns among news consumers, particularly regarding its application in covering sensitive topics such as politics and war. The report underscores the importance of human oversight of AI applications, with respondents expressing more trust in AI-assisted tasks such as transcription and translation. At Reuters, the need for human oversight was fundamental to our approach. Generative AI is being adopted for text-based news, but with safe experimentation platforms and training for our journalists. We will continue to integrate AI in journalism, grounded in a belief that it must be done without compromising the integrity of human reported stories. Globally, this year brings a record number of global elections, and with it, escalating concerns about misinformation, with notable increases in distrust, especially on platforms like TikTok and X, where misinformation about events such as the war in Gaza and King Charles' health have been prevalent. Despite these challenges, trust in news remains stable at 40%. This report highlights that trust is primarily influenced by high journalistic standards, transparency, impartiality, and fairness, principles that guide all we do at Reuters under the Thomson Reuters Trust Principles. As we navigate the challenges laid out in this year's Digital News Report, the insights we'll hear about today are invaluable in helping all of us adopt and continue to earn the trust and attention of our readers and audiences. So thank you for joining us today. I now have the pleasure of introducing Rasmus Nielsen, director of the Reuters Institute, who will join us to cover the research. I will also just note as he's coming to the stage, this is your last digital news event. And so I just want to thank you on behalf of all of us for your contributions over the last 6 years. And we wish you the best. And thank you for your support of journalism.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul, for the kind words for our work at the Institute and for me. So what I wanted to do today is to share just a few key highlights from this piece of research that we do every year. Everything we do is publicly available on the Institute website. So if you're interested in digging deeper into some of this, then by all means seek out those different resources. As Paul said, the Reuters Institute Digital News Report is a truly global piece of research. It covers 47 markets on 6 continents, accounting for more than half of the world's population. It's an online survey, so I should stress that in the countries we cover with limited internet penetration, this will underrepresent the habits and preferences and views of older people and less privileged people who don't have full access or no access at all to the internet. But in a country like the United States, we have a nationally representative sample with quotas on age, gender, income, education, as well as political orientation. This work is made possible by 19 different sponsors. The Google News Initiative is our main sponsor for this piece of work. We're also supported by Reuters, our host here, by the BBC, NHK, media regulators, universities, and foundations across the world. The big theme of this year's report is what we think of as a series of platform resets that are really changing the role of news within and the ways in which people access and use news through different kinds of platform intermediaries. I think one of the most visible and keenly felt illustrations of this is one that newsrooms is keenly aware of, is the relatively declining role of news within Facebook as a social media platform, from a high point in 2016 where 42% of our respondents in 12 countries we tracked for some time said they've gotten news while using Facebook in the last week. We're down to just 26% this year. It's still the single most widely used platform, apart from search, in terms of news discovery, but it is much diminished in terms of how many people say they get news while using Facebook. What has happened meanwhile is that a number of other platforms, video platforms, messaging applications, and other social platforms have grown in importance for news discovery. So by now in 2024, we have 5 different platforms that are identified by 10% or more of our respondents as being a way in which they access news, whereas back in 2014 it was just 2 that had that kind of user base. Part of this is about the emergence of relatively new arrivals, such as TikTok, of course intensely discussed in the United States at the political level and a few other countries. And it's really widely used for news, in particular amongst younger people and in global south markets where much of the online population is younger folks who embrace these new video-led platforms as a way to access news. But also some significant use in some of the high-income democracies that we cover in the report. But it's not only about new entrants, it's also a long-standing platform such as YouTube, very widely used for a range of different purposes, but also increasingly widely used for news. Again, particularly pronounced in a number of global south markets with younger, mobile-first, platform-first internet user bases, but also by now widely used for news in a number of global north markets. So who do people rely on when they get news on platforms like these? This year we asked people who say that they get news on different video and social platforms to name the voices or brands that they relied upon. In the United States, a lot of the most frequently named individual creator accounts are partisan and opinionated voices, some of them coming out of a long history in legacy media, Tucker Carlson, for example. Others are more sort of digitally native, but still very opinion-led personalities like Joe Rogan and others on the list here. But at the same time, it's really important to recognize that people also very often identify established media brands, right? So amongst the people who say they get news in this way, 42% of the mentions are of mainstream news brands or they're journalists, and these brands are much more widely named as sources people rely on social platforms than any of the individual creators. So yes, a prominent role for creators in the US, very often opinionated ones, but still also a very important role for brands in this environment. Now, some of this is about short videos. We see this in TikTok and we see this in a number of other platforms that have embraced the short format. But it's not only about short form videos, right? Half of our respondents say that they've consumed longer form online news videos in the last week. Some of these are, again, these sort of opinion, chat-based conversational programs. Again, some of them coming out of long-standing broadcast personalities who have moved onto these online platforms and deliver various kinds of monologues or some form of dialogue in these environments. But across the world, we also see new kinds of voices rise to prominence here. They also often are men. These are some of the examples that we've seen across the world. Hugo Decrypt in France, Jack Kelly with TLDR in the UK, Vita Spihar here in the US, and others are examples, I think, of younger voices who share some timeless values of journalistic impartiality and independence, but also adopt the new vernacular language and new platforms and new formats to share the news and summarize the news and discuss the news for audiences. When we turn to the public's reasoning around why they rely more on video, the qualitative research we do identifies some of the reasons people highlight. A sense of authenticity and trust, that you sort of what you see is what you get on video platforms. A sense of convenience, that one can access news on platforms one is using already for other reasons all the time. And also a sense that these platforms can provide a way to get more and different perspectives than what people may feel they get from more conventional offers. So these platform resets in part are about changes in platform strategies from different competing companies. They are also about the emergence of more popular formats such as video, as well as people's own perception of what it is that they seek in this environment. It's driven by consumer choice, yes. This doesn't mean that people are naive about the risks that are also associated with this environment. So we see widespread worries about misinformation and people being very thoughtful about what it takes to navigate reliable and unreliable content in these environments. At the top level, we have a further increase in the percentage of people say that they are concerned about whether what they see when it comes to online news is real or fake. 59% across these markets say that they are concerned or very concerned about whether what they see in online news is real or fake. So very widespread public concern, even higher in a number of countries, including this one, that either are having or has recently had elections, so very widespread concern. But it's also the case that much of the public feels reasonably confident about their own ability to tell the difference between trustworthy and untrustworthy sources of news on different platforms. So as you can see here, when we ask people about how easy or difficult people find it to tell apart trustworthy and untrustworthy news and information on each of the following platforms that they themselves have used to get news, in most cases a large share, and in several cases a clear majority of people say that they find it easy or relatively easy to tell the difference between trustworthy and untrustworthy sources. And there are some who are concerned, yes, and in particular quite a lot of people who are concerned about what they see on Facebook, even more on X, and more yet on TikTok. But again, it's a mix here of some differentiation by platform, but broadly quite a lot of public confidence in people's ability to navigate these environments for themselves at least. Now, all these platform resets are before we even start to think about what generative AI might mean. I mean, I think it's clear to everyone that there is something afoot here, but where it's heading is still unclear. And I think that's very much the way that much of the public thinks about the role of AI in the news as well. So to get a sense of people's comfort with the rollout of these kinds of technologies more broadly in news, we asked a sort of a high-level question about how comfortable people are with relying on news that is mainly AI-generated with some human oversight. And we can compare that with the levels of comfort with news that is mainly generated by humans with some help from AI, right? And what we find here is a clear premium at this stage in the public on the human role in journalism, on humans being in the loop when it comes to news, right? So much greater levels of comfort with news that is mainly created by humans with some help from AI over news that is mainly created with AI with some human oversight. I like to think that this is an important finding both for news organizations who are thinking about their use of these technologies, but also for platform companies of different kinds, whether search engines or social media, when they think about how they might approach the use of these technologies when it comes to news. In our more qualitative work, we explore people's levels of comfort with different kinds of use around news. And generally what we find is a greater acceptance, as Paul said in his opening remarks, with a reliance or partial reliance on these tools when it comes to back-end, behind-the-scenes tasks. So sort of editing, translation, summarization to some extent. There is also some acceptance or at least an openness to the use of generative AI to deliver news in new ways, the integration of AI summaries and stories themselves perhaps, and other kinds of versioning, but much less acceptance at this stage of using AI to create content and publish direct to the public. When we turn from people's concerns about AI and what it might mean in the future to the issue of trust, again, as Paul said, this year the findings around trust in news suggest some stability. We've seen a decline in recent years, but in this year compared to last year, it is actually stable. 40% across the 46 markets we look at say that they trust, feel they can trust most news most of the time. There's a lot of country variation here. The United States is one of the countries in our sample with lower levels of trust, 32%, again, stable compared to last year. So yes, we do have a sort of contentious election year coming up, but actually I think in this stage we're basically at the same level of trust in news as we were in 2015 in the United States, and stable also compared to last year. We don't want to only admire the problems in this area, right? We also want to help publishers and others who care about the role of news in our societies think about how they carry themselves and how they might earn and maintain trust from the public. So this year we asked our respondents to answer a set of questions about which factors are important for them when they make decisions about which sources of news they consider trustworthy. The frustration for publishers of this kind of research is that everything matters. Anyone who's done any kind of qualitative or market research will recognize this finding. But the important thing here, I think, still is that we can distinguish between things that matter for large majorities of people and things that are relatively less widely identified as being important, right? So there are many, many more respondents who identify high journalistic standards around factual accuracy, for example, transparency and openness, both about how news is reported, but also about things like ownership and funding models, a perception of a freedom from bias, as the trust principles would have it, of outlets that do not exaggerate or sensationalize the news reporting, and importantly, that represents people like the respondent fairly. So I think what's encouraging here from the point of view of many journalists and news organizations is that much of the public say that they want things that many journalists and publishers would like to offer them. Now, I think we need to recognize, of course, that at the same time what we are documenting here is some broadly shared common norms around what people say that they want from news. Now, as anyone who's ever thought about sort of the golden rule or other broadly shared norms, we can still come to very different conclusions about what we think of whether different entities are living up to these rules, right? So this relatively broad shared views does not mean that people think the same of different outlets or whether they are trustworthy, but the standards by which they judge them actually are broadly shared across age, across gender, across income and education, and interestingly across political views as well. So these are broadly shared norms. Now, to offer any of this, of course, publishers need to also run a sustainable business. We ask a set of questions around paying for news every year. Again, this is an area where we document some stability this year. It seems to be the case that in a number of markets by now we sort of hit a ceiling in terms of how many people are willing to pay at the current price points and the current offers, so no growth in the last 3 years in the number of people who say that they have paid in the last year for online news. When we look at which brands succeed in this environment, the pattern generally is a winner-takes-most story where a few large national upmarket brands account for a very large share, often the large majority of all the subscriptions in the data set. That is very much the case here in the United States with the New York Times pulling ahead of its direct competitive set, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, but also Apple News Plus figuring here as well. But this is really a pattern in most of the markets we look at is this very strong winner-takes-most dynamics centered around upmarket national brands. This year, we wanted to get a sense of what people say they're actually paying for these subscriptions, and that helps us document, for example, that there seems to be very widespread discounting in this competition to sign up and retain subscribers. So in the United States, for example, about half of those who are currently paying say that they're paying under what the average subscription cost is, according to the sticker price from publishers. We also wanted to get a sense of what the potential might be to convince more people to pay. So we asked those who are not currently paying what, if anything, they might be convinced to pay. About a third of our respondents say they are at least open to the idea of paying less than $10 a month, in most cases quite a lot less than $10 a month, for some kind of news offer. So some openness, but well below the average subscription price of the brands we look at in the research. And then, of course, very significantly, the majority of those who are not currently paying say they aren't willing to pay anything for news. That people are, at this stage, many people are perfectly content with the news they can get for free at the point of consumption, whether provided by commercial entities, nonprofit entities, or others who provide news for free. Part of the reason here might be that people aren't necessarily all that convinced by the value proposition as they see it of many publishers, but part of it can also just be about the issues around news avoidance and fatigue that we find in our research, right? That there is I think, really a weakening of the social contract between much of the public and much of news. So we have documented for some time in our research declining interest in the news in many countries. Not everywhere, I hasten to add, but in many countries we've seen very large declines in how many people say they're interested in the news in the years we've done this work. We also have growing concerns about what we identify as selective news avoidance, or the number of people say that they often or sometimes actively try to avoid the news, up 10 percentage points since 2017 when we first asked this question, 39% this year. And a similar number of people say they feel overwhelmed by the amount of news these days, right? So declining interest, growing news avoidance, and a real sense of fatigue amongst much of the public. Again, we don't want to only admire the problem here. We also try to understand what publishers might do or do differently to respond to some of these concerns. And what we've done this year is to take the model around user needs that was originally developed inside the BBC News, the idea of sort of identifying a number of things that people might want from the news. And this year we've asked people questions about how important these things really are from people's point of view in terms of what they want from the news. Again, everything is important, at least to someone, but also, as with trust, we can identify some things that are far more widely identified as important in terms of people's perceived user needs around news. Keep me up to date, help me learn more about topics and events, and offer different perspectives on topical issues. And as with trust, right, I think there is something encouraging here in that much of the public say that they want things from journalism that many journalists would like to offer the public. How well do people then feel that they are doing at this? Actually not bad, generally. I think that's important to recognize. From the point of view of the public, it's not at all clear that there is a crisis in the media. People generally feel that their needs are fairly well met by what they're relying upon. But by looking at the gap between how many say something is important and how many say that they are being well served in this area, we can calculate what we call the user needs priority index, which essentially is multiplying the gap between these two figures by the number of people who say that something is important to get a sense of what the market opportunity might be here. And what our data suggests is that the biggest opportunities here are around offering people more perspective. Remember, this is also one of the reasons people say they rely on platforms and video, right, to get more different perspectives, as well as, interestingly, this idea of inspiring me to give a different take on the news than simply things that went wrong in the world yesterday. So, in closing, just a few key findings summary, and then I'll invite the panelists up to join us so we can kick off the discussion and then the monologue part of this morning's event. We are documenting this sort of ongoing online platform reset, where some platforms seem to be withdrawing from the news, or at least pulling back, and others are trying to keep traffic within their platforms. And traffic to publishers is likely to be more unpredictable, with worries about the impact of AI, for example, on search. We see video formats on the rise. I have been very jaded about this myself after the infamous pivot to video some years ago. But this year we see some evidence that this is a consumer-led growth in the role of video, and a real appreciation of some of the distinct affordances of video as a way to access news online. AI in the news is regarded with some skepticism from much of the public, or a real premium on humans in the loop. And it provokes considerable skepticism, in particular around important subjects such as political coverage or coverage of international conflicts. Subscription growth seems to have stalled. The majority are still not paying for news, and people essentially seem to suggest that they're not really willing to pay in the future either. They seem to be perfectly content with what they can access for free. And there is, I think, a well-documented by now problem of perceived value from the proposition of most news publishers. But also, I think, some opportunities identified in the research this year. Many people have said do not feel a crisis in news. They feel that the news does provide much of what they need in many areas and want in many areas, in particular in terms of keeping people up to date with the news, but less so when it comes to providing different perspectives on issues and topics of the day, or understanding or inspiration. So perhaps this suggests some future possibilities for publishers. As said, all the work is available on the Institute website if you want to drill in more detail. But before we get to that, I will invite up the panelists to kick off the discussion, and then we'll open up with questions towards the end. So if I could ask Kristina, Ken, and Claudio to please join me on stage, we will open the panel discussion part of this. Thank you. So I wanted to start with getting people's perspective on the platform reset and how you think about this in terms of the challenges and opportunities from a publisher point of view, but also in terms of how you're navigating this from a platform point of view from Google. So Ken, do you want to kick us off from a Reuters point of view, how you think about the platform reset?
Sure. Actually, can you hear me? Does this work? I'll try this again. All right. So I actually thought we might start with the Google person first, but I'll kick it off. Yes, everything in the report, I think publishers have felt over the last couple of years. This migration from sort of this sort of socially generated referral for news has actually renewed interest in SEO over the last couple of years, and right as generative AI now figures more prominently in search. So I think where we're heading is this kind of platform shift is yet again going to surprise publishers, where sort of search generated experiences or AI overviews will have a significant impact on the next phase of sort of platform shift. So I think that's an all-consuming issue that we've been dealing with and we've been hearing about from publishers at the moment. So.
Kristina, I think Ken suggested we should hear from you, and then we'll turn to Claudio.
Sure. So I think one of the data points that was interesting in the report was looking at different cohorts and their platform preferences. And if we look at cohorts of under 35 and over 35, search was actually pretty similar in terms of the preferences, whereas there was a much bigger difference between preferences. That better? All right. There was a much bigger difference between preferences of social media platforms, video platforms like YouTube, between those two cohorts. And so that's something that we think a lot about in terms of where should we invest? Who are we investing for when we're building our products and features? Do we invest in addressing those trends that we're seeing among younger consumers, even if those younger consumers do not currently have a higher propensity to spend? And I think sometimes there's a tendency for us to think those younger consumers will eventually sort of graduate or mature into the trends that we see with older cohorts. But I think we've seen sort of time and time again that it's actually the opposite that can happen, right? The trends that we see within younger consumers, we might start to see other cohorts start to drift into that space. And so we might actually want to start to disproportionately invest in addressing those younger trends. And I think that's something that we constantly think about.
Yeah, and what I would say is I think it's twofold, right? I think one thing that we're definitely seeing is that, when social media came of age 10 to 15 years ago, and we're talking about Twitter and Facebook specifically, when you think about it within a newsroom, those were platforms that were very, I wouldn't say easy, but sort of comfortable for newsroom reporters and editors to really transition to. When you introduce TikTok, when you introduce Instagram, when you introduce YouTube, it's a completely different skill, right? And I think what you're seeing a lot of newsrooms are, I would say, moving in a direction where they want to go outside for that talent instead of actually developing that talent internally. And then I think second of all is habituation, right? When you think about paywalls and a lot of the conversation that was mentioned earlier, I think what we're seeing is this speed to try to convert you, right? This speed that, hey, if you like this article, then you should subscribe right now because it's a great piece of journalism. But what I think is really important is that you have to build a base of users that get used to your product consistently and are able to say, well, you know what? I enjoy The Athletic, I enjoy the New York Times, I enjoy this other platform, but that's going to take time, right? And when you look at the models across different newsrooms, you don't necessarily see conversion happen the first week or the second week, but you see it happen within a month or 3 months. So I think those are the two areas that really kind of stood out to me, the habituation of a user, but also at the same time, kind of this aversion to actually converting people within our newsroom into reporters that can show up on these specific platforms.
I want to get back to this sort of point about the types of sort of talent and creative talents that we're seeing emerging here and how publishers might think about that. But before that, I just wanted to pick up on something that Kristina said, which is the sort of a belief that in my experience, many publishers find very comforting, the idea that, oh, when they grow up, they will embrace our platforms. I am here to tell you this is not true. We have every reason to believe that people's interest and informational needs evolve in the course of their life, but fewer reasons to believe that their platform preferences do so. The moment that my wife and I settled down and had our daughter, we didn't suddenly feel a great biological urge to have a landline phone and rely on terrestrial broadcast television. And similarly, I don't think we can reasonably expect that, when a younger generation comes of age, that they will suddenly think, I really wish that there was a website with like pop-up ads and a request for notifications that I really feel I need to make central in my life. So yes, people's informational needs and interests will change in the course of their life, but their platform preferences tend to be sort of set pretty early and then evolve with as you say, new opportunities. But in terms of the voices that we see grow to greater prominence on some of these platforms, Kristina, you talked about the sort of how you think about this from a platform point of view. Can you expand a little bit about how you think about the role of influencers around news?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of the data that I think we're not. Oh. We got flashing. All right. Yeah, I think a lot of the data that we saw was there's sort of the rise of this new content creator, and we think a lot about this. If you think about traditional Google search, this is not necessarily a platform where you see a lot of influencer content, and so as a platform that's looking to organize the world's information, we need to start to think about how do we actually bring in these various perspectives. And I'll sort of tie this back to, the idea of trust. And we have seen that younger consumers who we might think of as, having a higher propensity to look towards influencers. And when we think about news content in particular, not only does the Digital News Report suggest, but another piece of research that we support, the Next Gen News Report, suggests that there's sort of a different type of relationship that consumers have with an influencer or trust in an individual as opposed to trust with an institution. And so that is sort of a shift that we are seeing. And so thinking about different ways of building trust with that type of audience. And so the Next Gen News Report has an interesting framework to think about this, but we're also thinking about this in terms of the tone that's used, the style of content that's used. I think we're seeing both really interesting ways that both traditional media organizations as well as some of these new journalistic creators are trying to tap into that. So whether it's bringing forward the lived experiences through extended bylines with traditional media organizations, whether it's distributing content through these video platforms, either in short form video or long form video. I think sometimes we assume that influencers means short form video, but that's actually not the case. It's really about meeting the user where they are and forming that relationship and trust in that way. We're seeing some interesting models out there, a number that were mentioned, Jack Kelly, for example, in the UK, many others around the world as well.
Claudio, you alluded to some of the sort of talent or skill sets that you see being exhibited here. Can you say a bit more about how you think about that?
Oh, absolutely. Sports is completely different because now the athletes are the influencers, right? The athletes are the ones that 30 minutes after a game, they just go ahead and drop a video podcast on YouTube and say, this is what happened, this is what didn't happen. So what's been interesting about the athletics newsroom over the last year and a half is that we've literally had to have a person on the audience team track like the podcast division. And when I say podcast division, I mean the podcast space. So when the NBA finals were going on, we were like, all right, what's the podcast that came out last night? And we would actually have to make editorial decisions on a daily basis as to whether we think this is news or not. So now, while we saw those examples of influencers who sort of live outside of the space, now we have the athletes doing it with expertise added to it and almost beating our reporters to the expertise angle of things. So it's really caused us to think really differently about athlete voices. I think in the past, you would naturally sort of like put them in a corner and shrug them off. And now that's not the case, just because they have so many followers, so many subscribers, and they're coming straight to market way before you wake up in the morning. So it's totally, I think, out of most spaces, I think it's really upended it in a way and really changed the way we have to think about news production on a daily basis.
Ken, do you see this in other areas than sport?
It's horrifying. I'm kidding. And I'm going to walk off the stage and make one of my reporters dance to news today. But I think this news influencers or discussion of are frequently framed through the lens of, that it's mutually exclusive, that it's one or the other, and the data might show that there is audience migration. But I think, at least in my corner of the universe in tech, there are fairly prominent influencers. I mean, they're reporters, frankly, who deliver a different kind of product and value that's additive to the kind of news ecosystem. There's one guy in particular who I'm a big fan of, Marcus Brownlee, who has been doing this on YouTube for, I think, at least a decade. And he gets interviews with Elon Musk and Bill Gates, and he speaks authoritatively, but in a very authentic and not ivory tower kind of way, which audiences, including this one, appreciates. And he delivers something that is very different than what a news organization like Reuters does, which we have different stories about the world's richest men. I find that it's more additive than reductive.
Congratulations on the Pulitzer. I know it didn't make you many friends in the company in question, but I wonder whether either of you have any views on sort of if there is some opportunity here for complementarity. Are there also sometimes situations where news organizations in particular have to make a choice about whether they embrace the vernacular and formats and sort of style of these platforms, or whether they stick to inherited values around, for example, impartiality and freedom from bias? I mean, I think a number of news organizations have had some friction around the way in which individual reporters use social platforms and others, even as the companies are also trying to use these for their own editorial and commercial purposes.
I think authenticity is very important, and I think even in experimenting in new formats and new styles, the audience will know when it's fake, when it feels fake, and especially an organization like Reuters, which is underpinned by a thing called the trust principle, which is an obligation for a journalist to act independently, freedom from bias, and with integrity. There are limits to what we can do, and it would just not feel right if we had done those things. Though in terms of style and techniques, I think we see some experimentation on that end. I mean, we've been doing podcasts for a while, and that's expanding. I think our newsletters are also expanding as well. So there are ways to do this authentically, as in keeping with our brand and what we stand for.
Claudio?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue with most news publishers in general has been that we haven't even leaned in slowly. We just haven't leaned in, really. Like, we kind of got to the space and said, all right, like, what's the best approach to get people back to our website, right? Versus kind of thinking of how we actually approach those platforms in a way that's actually conducive to the user on there. I think one of the things that a lot of publishers may not do really well is really just ask the people that follow them on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, like, why do you follow me, right? And I think that's a really important question to ask, because as much as we talk about subscriptions in general, the reality is, like, if you go down the list, you'll see the Washington Post has 2 million TikTok followers, right? The Times has 18 million on Instagram. I think The Guardian has like 10 million on Twitter, right? So you have like an addressable audience, while we may think it's not an addressable audience, right? it's an audience. If you actually take a specific approach to those platforms, you could potentially convert at some point. So I do think that newsrooms don't have to go, head into the water overnight, but I do think they have to find a way to make sure that when they're writing that 4,000 word story covering the Amazon, or 4,000 word story covering a town in Russia, that they can actually have some sort of video component to it to kind of show how a specific journalist or editor really went through the process of really tackling that story. Because I think what ends up happening for the most part is that you just see bylines and you see 4,000 words, and the only line is for a reporter is the byline. And you don't necessarily get an idea of what that reporter did or what that reporter went through to actually report that story. So I think it's extremely important to really kind of lean into those platforms and lean into it much more than we're actually doing so at the moment.
I was just going to add one thing, because podcasts were mentioned. I don't think any of us would have thought, as podcasts started, that adding a video component to a podcast, why would anyone want to watch people, recording a podcast online? But I think this idea of experimentation and sort of testing different ways of generating that relationship directly with an audience through a different channel is sort of the spirit of that.
I will just briefly insert an example of a publisher that happens to be from my native Denmark that I think has worked very shrewdly with these platforms to pursue their own editorial mission, but also their own commercial imperatives, which is Zetland, a digital native publisher, which has worked with its members, but also with influencers and creators who mention their journalism, to encourage more people to sign up as members. So really proactively reaching out to people they see discussing their journalism online, and offering them to work together on promoting that brand with recognition of this partnership, which I think is just a very interesting way to lean into this online community and this not just addressable audience, but these ambassadors, if you will, for their journalism. Perhaps other publishers could think about a similar thing. We should talk about money, because at the end of the day, publishing in most cases is a business as well. I think the findings we have around pay are in one sense encouraging. 10 years ago, there was a world in which some people believed the paywall was history, this was never going to work, people weren't going to pay, information wanted to be free, all of that. Now we clearly live in a world in which some people are willing to pay, and some publishers are doing rather well for themselves. But there remains a lot of challenges in this space for many individual publishers and a large part of the public that isn't paying. Claudio, you talked a little bit about the role of habituation in terms of how to sort of convince people that your journalism is worth paying for. Do you want to expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, one of the main things, in a paywall world is, to repeat my earlier point, is that, users aren't necessarily given the chance to really acclimate themselves with your brand, right? One click and it's done, and that's pretty much it. But I think what's really going to be important for the most part, especially when you look across the big major publishers, is that the one thing that I don't necessarily get, even from all of them, is really what is the standout piece of journalism each day, right? I think you go on to a lot of these websites on a daily basis, sports, politics, news, whatever it may be, and I think they signal importance, at the top of the feed, right? They signal what they think is the most important news story of the day, but I don't necessarily know what's the story I must read that specific day, right? So I think there's a lot of things and little things that brands can actually do on a daily basis to actually signal to new users what is important and what they should read versus what they're kind of seeing on a daily basis, right? If you go to the homepage of like the top 3 or top 4 major news organizations nowadays, it'll be a lot of the same thread, right? Which I think in some respects ties to news fatigue, right? But I think what a lot of brands aren't necessarily doing is really finding a way to diversify what the top of their feed looks like. So when a user actually comes in, it's like, oh wow, the content experience here isn't just politics and hard news, it's actually lifestyle, it's actually health, it's actually sports, it's actually so many different things. I mean, I think outside of that, when you're thinking about paywalls in general, I think it's it's just a tough period in general when you're talking about subscriptions. And I've actually seen a lot of Latin American publishers, as an example, really kind of veer into different areas where they're focusing on events and focusing on series that really allow for users to kind of think of ways to kind of interact with their journalists. So I think a lot of it is focused on the journalism, but I also feel there's a part of it that really a lot of brands will have to extend the business model a little further and not necessarily rely on the journalism, I would say, nonstop.
Others who want to come in on the business side of things? Ken, Kristina?
The only thing I was going to add was to just jump on what Claudio was talking about in terms of extending. I was at an event in Southeast Asia, and we were talking to publishers locally about this topic, and understanding your audience and sort of this propensity to pay at a more micro level, I think, came up. And there was one publisher in particular that, surprisingly said the astrology section had the highest propensity to pay. And so they built sort of a model around that in particular. And I think it just alluded to this idea of like really understanding these micro segments of your audience and being creative about where those revenue streams may come from.
I suppose it is a form of seeking truth and reporting it. Ken, do you want to come in on the business side? Or?
I feel least equipped to do so, at least on the consumer retail side. We're still thinking through a paywall, which we've discussed, but we haven't announced a launch date yet. And we're primarily, not exclusively, we're a wholesaler, and there's a lot of B2B, and so we're paid for the journalism, just not specifically by a mass market reader. So.
I want to make sure we have a quick final round on AI before we open it up for questions from the people who've joined this morning. So, Ken, I know that you at Reuters you're working hard on rolling out different kinds of AI to power your journalism. Do you want to share something on how you're thinking about that?
Where do we start? It's a corporate-wide, but also an editorial newsroom-wide initiative. We're very aggressively experimenting. There are multiple work streams led by Jane Barrett, who who was at the London event, and she is the editorial liaison with TR Labs on a number of things. Everything from summarization, headline writing, translation, an extension of stuff that we've been doing, but in new ways. So, all of which, again, is underpinned by human editorial control. We're trying to get 2,500 people to think differently about using the technology and seeing how it could increase efficiencies around what we do. So,
Claudio?
I think the main area where I'll speak to the sports space really quickly. I think AI, at least now I'm crossing my fingers, wouldn't necessarily affect us too much just because Google, as Kristina knows really well, already has like scores and standings and things like that for so many years at this point that when a user searches for that, they naturally find it. I would say the main areas where it's probably going to affect things are on the more evergreen lifestyle topics, like Kristina mentioned earlier, health, astrology in some respects, and so many others, because those are the areas that can easily sort of be summarized by an AI machine. But I would say in a newsroom, I think what's extremely important is really finding ways to summarize content on a day-to-day level. Because I'm a big believer, and I used to say this in the New York Times newsroom all the time, when you get home at 7 p.m., you see that 3,000-word investigative story, but you probably don't want to read it, even though you want to understand every aspect of it. And I think really using AI in some respects to really kind of summarize content is going to be extremely important because you get home, you're doing so many tasks. You may want to watch Love Island if there's any Love Island viewers in the room. But I think it's really key to kind of do that because it allows a user, and it speaks to the popularity of newsletters, to wake up or to sit down and to really just read a quick summary and feel educated about a specific topic. And I feel at core, what everyone wants to feel is educated about a specific topic and being able to speak to it with their friends, on a daily basis.
Kristina, I know you're thinking about this from a product point of view, but also in terms of your partnerships.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Rasmus had asked us this question about, should we be embracing AI? I think the answer is yes. The question just is how. And we've sort of seen these technological inflection points sort of in the past with, the internet and mobile, and we would never have looked back and said we shouldn't have embraced that. But sort of as businesses, it's really our responsibility to ensure that we drive that trust with our consumers in order to make progress here. And I think the report sort of highlighted some of the challenges that we see today in this area as it relates to trust. And so I think first and foremost, it is up to us to sort of protect those put those safeguards in place. And as I was thinking about this question, I sort of thought about, 20 years ago, would we have felt comfortable putting our credit card number into a random website and expecting, a product to show up at our door? And the answer is probably no. And so it was really the institutions that were required to sort of ensure that we were driving incremental trust with these new shifts. So I think it starts with trust. And happy to talk a little bit more about this from either a consumer perspective or from a publisher perspective, because at Google we're also building a lot of tools and programs to drive education, AI literacy. I think we saw in the report that a lot of the mistrust comes from not understanding AI at its core, and so how can we drive just more of this understanding? But then also, what are the tools that we could offer to improve efficiencies in the newsroom? And there's a lot of really interesting experimentation that's going on within the news industry, but also within academic institutions and with institutions like Reuters and others that are looking into this.
Thank you. I know we should talk about trust as well, but I also want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience. So I'll open it up here. There is so much we could talk about, but to sort of simplify and clarify the discussion, if I could please encourage people to direct their questions to some of the findings from the research and some of the things the panelists have sort of said about that research or how they think about these research findings. I think that might help sort of center the conversation. When you ask your question, if you could please introduce yourself and then direct the question either at one of the panelists or if it's a data point at me. So we'll start here.
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Joseph Najam. I work at Reuters. Claudio, this question is specific for you. We're talking a lot about disruption in a way and how newsrooms can take learnings from a lot of different things that are taking place, especially in sports influence that's going on. I think there's a lot of disruption right now, specifically with women's sports. We know NFL is king in many ways in the US, but with Taylor Swift last year and the impacts of that, and then fast forward to Caitlin Clark and everything that's going there. What insights can you share with the room here from what your journalists are capturing through this phenomenon of the rise of women's sports in the US?
We'll take a couple of questions, and just to make sure we get a few in, and then
I'll be super brief.
Okay.
I think the main thing with women's sports is really, and this is going to sound more process focused. At The Athletic, we started really investing in women's sports about 1.5 years ago, or 2 years, I would say. But I think when the Caitlin Clark and the Angel Reese and everything happened with the WNBA, but also college basketball, we weren't necessarily like fully prepared at the onset. But what ended up happening is that we really started focusing on finding those voices within our newsroom, but also externally at the same time that can really have expertise on these topics. I think what's really important when you don't necessarily have expertise on a topic is not to try to convert people into experts, but really try to find the experts within a newsroom. So even when you think about Taylor Swift, I don't think we were we weren't in a place where we could talk about the entertainment aspects of things with Taylor Swift, but we could talk about the effect that it had on the specific players within the locker room throughout a season, right? So it's really just kind of like picking your spots and understanding where your expertise level lies versus really kind of jumping into areas that, quite frankly, you don't necessarily have, the expertise to really kind of share with an audience, if that makes sense.
Hi, I'm Benitez. I'm the professor of local journalism at Columbia University, and I wanted to ask about local journalism, local news. Do we know if people are going to these platforms also seeking local news? Is there any hope for local news in this extremely crowded ecosystem that we see right now with the platforms?
If one of you want to take a bite of this, otherwise I can say something from our research at the Institute.
Yeah, what I would say, and I would say credit to Google for sure. I think one of the last few years, one of the things, 3 or 4 years, one of the things that Google's done really well is they created a system called Google EAT, which stands for expertise, authoritativeness, and trust. I think one of the things that you saw for many years is that when something would happen in Kentucky, the New York Times would rank #1 on search for it, and now the Louisville Courier-Journal is ranking #1 on search for it, which is actually the right approach, right? So I do think on search specifically, there is a lot of life for local publishers because now, when something happens in Indianapolis or something happens in Chicago, we do see that local newspaper really rank much highly, and Google giving that space to those local publishers. I couldn't speak to the other platforms because I think they're a little less focused on news as in comparison to Google, but that would be what I think. I think there is hope for local journalism. I think it's just making sure that, if you're in Iowa or if you're in any of these other states, just making sure that you try to cover as much ground as you can, despite the limited resources that the brands may have.
I mean, I'll just add very briefly from the Institute research is I think the two things that happen at the same time, it remains the case that people are very interested in genuinely interesting and noteworthy information about their own local community. The problem for a lot of local news publishers is that their conception of local was actually more about distribution technology and market sort of advertising demand than it was about people's experience of what constituted a locality. So they were often quite remote, actually, from how people live their lives. I think everyone in New York can sort of recognize what this will feel like, but this is very present across the country and elsewhere too. And the other part of it is that a large part of the business of local news historically was not about news. It was about service and utilities information that people now get in other ways. So there is a clear demand for actual, original, relevant, impactful reporting at the really local level. But there is also a challenge of how one gets to deliver that from where local publishers are, because the legacy model honestly really wasn't about that. So.
Thank you for this. Thank you for this. And I'm Galgaski, I'm a journalist and researcher. And my question is for Ken about AI experimentation in newsrooms. You mentioned summarization, language translation. Are there any places where you, either through experimentation or editorial judgment, are deciding not to apply AI to the extent that you can speak to that?
Very distinctly, video and I think audio are areas that we're not touching at the moment. Due to sort of, first we don't know exactly where the sources are coming from, so there's a copyright issue. And there's just this environment of, belief that there's a lot of deep fakes out there. So, trust in what we say this thing is the most important thing at the organization. So it's video and visuals, not audio. So, very short answer.
My name is Darling. I work at the Pew Research Center. I guess I have two questions. How do you see the impact of newswires, for instance, the AP and AFP work, with some local news industries that funding is an issue. How do you see them partnering with the major newswires to supplement it, news coverage on what they publish on a daily basis? And I guess the second question is also how do you see print? Is there still a focus for publishers focusing and having the resources to print? For instance, my dad still reads the newspapers and he refuses to go online and he doesn't read any of the stories I send him online. He just looks at the newspapers.
Sorry, I want to make sure that I understand the first bit. Whose partnership with newswires? So AP and AFP's partnership with whom?
Basically, how do you see newswires and their importance in just working with local newspapers or other newspapers?
Ken, I think the agency one must be for you, so I can take a stab at the print side.
I don't know if I've got a good answer for the future of an agency that's not Reuters. We have seen, and it's been reported that the AP has lost partnerships with some of its members, but they've also signed deals with large language model companies, and that is and it goes beyond the newswires for all publishers. One potential lifeline, however lucrative it is, nobody really knows at this point, and that's a very rapidly evolving area. So, wish I had a better answer.
Claudio.
And I'll just add something really quickly from just from a Google perspective, just working with Google for so long. I think the AP in general and a lot of the newswire brands are really beneficial to a lot of local brands in terms of just supplementing content, right? Being able to have a much broader report in their local area if they're not necessarily able to really go to other areas of their state and cover or make coverage, great coverage. Where I do think it hasn't necessarily worked is on Google specifically, just because there's so many brands that take that local coverage. Google only recognizes the main source of it. So on that front, I think on one side it is supplemental and it's helpful, but I think on the other side it doesn't necessarily drive the audience that you may need.
I mean, I'll just quickly speak to the print point, and then I'll want to make sure once we're through the questions from the audience that we get a final round from the panelists on trust, which I know all of you are thinking about. I mean, I think on print, I'll say sort of three things. I mean, the first one is that print as a mass medium is dead. It is in one way inexorable structural decline. That doesn't mean that it is entirely gone. It does, as you say, still serve a niche, and it is a valued platform for some people. I think every publisher looking at their business right now understand that the unit economics go harder and harder as circulation declines. Distribution costs, production costs get sort of disproportionately higher as circulation declines. And it's very clear that we see some tipping points right now, and a lot of titles are really cutting weekdays or ceasing print distribution entirely. And then I think the third thing just to say is that I hope that that publishers are medium agnostic and platform agnostic and think really about how do we create value for people who rely on our journalism, and how do we do that in ways that can sustain our business. And print can play a role in that, and probably will play a role in that for some publishers for some time to come. I will just say, don't count on it, and don't expect it to be a mass distribution platform. It hasn't been for many years, and it will never be again. So, more questions from the room. Otherwise, we'll do a final round on trust from the panelists. This is amazing. A room full of journalists with no questions. I have to write this down in my diary. This is unprecedented. It feels like a special day in so many ways. Let's talk about trust then. I mean, I think from our point of view, you know, when we sort of document in our research that many people want things from journalism that many journalists would like to offer, we sometimes met with sort of incredulity and a sort of a view that can't possibly be true because people clearly want lunatics and sort of opinion material and fake news and whatnot. I obviously don't believe that's true. You know, I think we have the evidence to suggest that people have a set of views that are largely shared with much of the journalistic profession and much of the industry in terms of what they want from news. They want factual accuracy. They want clarity about what the editorial principles and if any editorial line of a publisher is, and they want some basic understanding of why people do the work that they do. You know, what's the business model? What's the ownership? What is the funding model of this entity? And if all of that is in place, then they are willing, at least in principle, to consider that this source could be trustworthy. But actually delivering on that and communicating that can be quite hard, as many publishers experience every day. And of course, it is also sometimes an adversarial environment where there are political actors and others who are deliberately trying to undercut, sometimes commercial actors too, trying to undercut the credibility of outlets that do reporting that they find inconvenient. So I want to take sort of a round from our panelists to hear their thinking about how outlets can sort of think about earning and maintaining, but also communicating around trust in news in this environment. Ken, can I start with you, because this is so central for Reuters with the trust principles?
It's especially difficult in such a politically charged environment that we've never seen before. Almost every news brand claims that they are unbiased. And that is difficult for an organization like Reuters, which is built upon that, that being unbiased and all over the world and non-political. I mean, it might sound glib, but from a programming perspective, talking to reporters and how we approach stories and talking to sources. The joke is, so long as everybody hates you equally, then you're in a good place, and that's actually not a joke. It's sort of true. If either side claims you have bias, means perhaps you're unbiased in some way, and the bias is actually to the facts. We're very monk-like in that way, I think, and we do what we've been doing for 170 years, and we will continue to do that in that way. And I think that kind of articulates, readers, that resonates with readers in some way.
Thanks, Ken. Claudio?
Yeah, I'll be quick. I mean, I think the main thing really just goes back to something that I think Kristina mentioned as well earlier, is really just how do we put our journalists front and center? And it's little things in terms of like author bios on a website. If you saw the Times recently just really kind of stretched out the author bios on the website to kind of really say like, hey, this reporter was in this specific region for 10 days talking to subjects on this specific topic. So to Ken's point, I think it's extremely hard in a society such as this one to really, kind of thread the needle in some respects. I think it's going to be hard to get, one side of the aisle to, consume your content versus another side of the aisle, just the way, polarization is in this country specifically and a lot of countries overseas as well. But I do think there's things that on platform and in other mediums like video, social media, et cetera, can really lend to more credibility and more trust with a specific platform. Do I think it's the magic bullet? Absolutely not. I think it's something that's going to take time to really, kind of grow that confidence with a brand, whether you're a legacy brand or you're a brand that's sort of starting out.
Yeah, I'll just add one quick point, sort of from a platform perspective. And I think the report showed sort of this user need, or a gap around showing different perspectives. And I think that's where, as a platform, we have an opportunity to really bring forward different perspectives on a particular topic to drive more of that trust.
On Claudio's point of trying to maintain some minimum level of commonality also in a very divided nation like this, I think a sort of an overlooked fact of recent years in the US is that, at least according to our data, the reach of what I think some people would consider to be sort of establishment liberal East Coast media, ABC, CBS, the New York Times, the Washington Post, amongst people in the United States who identify as being clearly politically on the right, has actually grown in recent years. And while it is true that the reach is nowhere near Fox News, it is also true that half of people in this country who identify as politically on the right do not use Fox News. Many of those people rely on media that prominent right-wing politicians would call liberal media, would call mainstream media and whatnot. And in fact, our data suggests that while their trust in news is limited, they often trust these sources more than they trust news in general. So I'm not here to say that this is easy. It certainly is not easy, and it's certainly not made easier by orchestrated, high-profile, direct political attacks, or commercial attacks for that matter, on the credibility of news organizations. But I think it's also important to recognize that it's not impossible, and that there are millions of conservatives in this country who rely on media that the politicians they vote for tell them are liberal. And for people who believe in some shared universal fact, perhaps that is not such a bad thing, and perhaps that is a sort of a partial success that we should recognize as well. With that, I will just thank all of you for coming out today. I will thank Reuters for hosting us, and I will thank our amazing panelists for sharing their thoughts on our research. So thank you so much.